Of people signed in, and it's 7 o'clock. So if you would like to read the introduction, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you for joining us this evening for the May 4th, 2021 Monte Sereno City Council meeting. Before the meeting is called to order, I would like to point out a few house rules to assist council members, staff, and members of the public to successfully participate in this meeting. Council members, your microphone is live, so please keep your microphones on mute until you wish to speak. For tonight's meeting, we are using Zoom to host the City Council regular meeting. At the bottom of the Zoom client, there are two icons, chat and raise hand. Please use chat only to report technical issues such as being unable to hear a council member speaking. Please use raise hand to be recognized by the mayor and enabled to speak to the council. To comment under oral communication or any agenda item, you are allowed 3 minutes to speak per item. Emails limited to 350 words can also be submitted to the city clerk and it will be read into the record. This word limit is set to adhere to the typical 3-minute time allowance. Only attendees using the Zoom application can use the raise hand option to comment. Participants calling in from a telephone will only be able to listen and cannot provide feedback or comment. Lastly, because we are not all in the same room, all votes at this meeting will be taken by roll call.
Thank you. I hereby call the meeting of the Monte Sereno City Council for Tuesday, May 4th, 2021 to order. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Lawler?
Present.
Councilmember Mekachek?
Present.
Councilmember Turner?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Elahi?
Present.
And Mayor Luthold.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Leonardis and Ms. Radcliffe, do you have any changes to the orders of the day?
I don't.
All right. And I believe we do not have any presentations tonight. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And now is the time for oral communications. This is the time for members of the public who wish to speak briefly about matters which are not on the agenda tonight to be recognized and have 3 minutes to address questions or comments to the council. If any members of the public wish to speak at oral communications, please raise your hand on Zoom to be recognized. Seeing none, we will proceed to written communications. Written communications. Ms. Radcliffe, do we have any written communications that have not made it into the agenda packet?
We do not.
All right, thank you. Now let's take a look at the consent calendar. This is items 1 through 3 on the consent calendar. Do we have any members of the council wishing to pull any of the items that are on the consent calendar tonight? If so, please wave your hand at me or raise your hand on Zoom. Seeing none, do we have any members of the public wishing to address any of the items in public comment or to pull any of these matters for further discussion? If so, please raise your hand at this time. Seeing none, we will now turn to council questions. If council has any brief questions about these matters, please raise your hand and you can address them to staff. And if not, if we have a motion to approve the consent calendar, someone can bring that. Mr. Mekachek.
So moved to approve the consent calendar. I'll second that.
I have a motion by Councilmember Mekachek with a second by Mayor Pro Tem Elahi. Councilmember Turner?
Yes.
Councilmember Lawler?
Yes.
Councilmember Mekachek?
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Elahi?
Aye.
And Mayor Luthold.
Yes.
That motion passes 5-0.
Okay, we will now proceed to public hearings. We have no unfinished business, so turning to new business. The first matter of new business is introduction of an ordinance number NS-226, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Monte Sereno enacting Chapter 4.20, gun storage regulations. Do we have a staff report on this, Mr. Leonardis?
Thank you, Mayor. No staff report, just the introduction of the item before the council this evening is to hear the first reading of the ordinance of the City Council of Monte Sereno for Chapter 4.2.0, the gun storage regulations. And if there are questions for council, myself or Mr. Rudin can answer those questions.
All right, thank you. Before we open to public comment, do we have any initial questions by members of the council directed at anyone here? Yes, Mr. Mikuchak.
Mr. Leonardis, did you have Los Gatos Monte Sereno PD review the proposed ordinance, and did they have any comments on it?
Thank you, Councilmember Mikuchak. Myself and Mr. Rudin had a Zoom meeting with the Chief of Los Gatos Police, Chief DeSena, about a week ago, and they had no issues with the ordinance as written.
All right. Any further questions of staff? If not, we will open this to public comment. If there are any members of the public wishing to speak on this matter, please raise your hand to be recognized. And while we're waiting for people to raise their hand, I will note that we have received public comments which have been lodged as part of the agenda in this meeting. And those have presumably been reviewed by the council members and are available. Do we have, this is last call for any members of the public wishing to be heard on the gun storage regulation? Seeing none, we will close this for public comment and we will return to council member discussion at this time. Council members, any discussion? Yes, Councilmember Turner.
Yes, I had after our last meeting, I requested that our city attorney meet with our police chief to discuss this ordinance. And I had some questions that I sent to him, and I'd like some answers to those questions, please. And one of them is, have we had any instances of people being injured or killed with firearms in Monte Sereno and Los Gatos that this ordinance might have prevented?
In our discussions with the police chief, I don't believe we were aware of any firearm related incidents in Monte Sereno specifically, but as the ordinance points out, that those are possibilities, and there have been similar types of incidents in other jurisdictions in the vicinity.
Okay, may I ask another question, please?
Yes, go ahead.
Could you please talk about how this ordinance would be enforced? Will the police come to people's homes and search for unsecured firearms?
No. In general, enforcement of this ordinance would be limited by the Fourth Amendment. In general, you need to have probable cause before you can conduct any sort of search. With respect to misdemeanors and private residences, you would need to obtain a court warrant before conducting a search of someone's private residence. So the likelihood of enforcement would, absent some sort of actual firearms related incident, which would give, cause to enter a residence on its own, with the enforcement of this particular ordinance would be somewhat limited.
May I ask a third question?
Sure, you've got the stage until you give it up, or you talk too long and I'll let you know.
Probably my greatest concern is the potential for an ordinance like this to be abused. A postal next door, a call that's not a caller that's done identified. What happens when neighbors get into disputes and one of them calls the police to report that the other one has unsecured firearms in his home? How will the police handle this? And doesn't this put our police in a difficult position, getting involved in disputes between neighbors?
So again, unless they have a legal basis to be inside of the residence already, which would include responding to some sort of firearms related incident, in response to just a mere complaint by a neighbor or a concerned citizen, the police department would need to seek a court order in the form of a warrant, which would be approved by an independent judge who would determine whether or not there's probable cause to conduct a search. So, this I think the concern about, a neighbor causing, some sort of invasion, I think is not, a realistic scenario, because the police department would need to, prioritize enforcement of this along with all the other things that they have to enforce.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Turner, any further questions, or did you want to make any comments generally about the issue, or reserve on that until later?
I'm sorry, there's an echo. I couldn't understand you.
Oh, did you want to ask any further questions, or do you want to speak to your thoughts about the ordinance, or would you like to do that later?
Oh, I can do it later.
Okay. Other council members, any other questions or comments, discussion that you'd like to bring forward? Yes, Councilmember Lawler.
Thank you. Well, I mean, first of all, I just want to say that as a community, I think it's really important for us to use everything available to us to protect our families and our children. So to me, it seems like a no-brainer to provide an extra layer of protection that is very easy and amenable to existing gun owners. And I just want to, I've been doing some research, and I just wanted to quote the city attorney from San Diego. San Diego also had a safe storage ordinance go into effect in September of 2019. And I quote, "The city of San Diego is one of the nation's safest cities because we enact simple common sense laws that protect children and other vulnerable community members. Safe storage is proven to prevent tragedies and save lives by keeping guns out of the hands of minors, unauthorized users, and individuals going through personal crises that could result in them harming themselves or others. We are all safer when this law is followed," end quote. So I thought that that was a helpful perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Elahi, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I understand there are some reservations, but really, if you can even save one life or one injury because of this ordinance, then I think we've done our job. The whole idea is, I think this is really, I feel this is an ordinance the gun lobby should be promoting, because they'd want their guns to be secure and not have it fall into wrong hands, or not have it used at the last minute because somebody's upset and they can just reach for the gun. And I'm guessing, but I would think most gun owners already have a storage cabinet, or depending on how many guns they have, or a storage box to protect their guns. So it probably doesn't have much effect on most gun owners. So I think this is the least we can do. I mean, there's a lot more that needs to be done, but we always have to comply with the amendments, the Second Amendment, and to make sure that we don't do anything in opposition to that amendment. But there's a lot more that can be done, and this is the very minimum that we can do. So I would fully support the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Mekachuk.
I read the correspondence that we received on this, and I've given it some thought, and I support the ordinance as written. I would agree with the other sentiments that if we can help prevent one accidental death in a moment, then I think that we have done what we can do. So I would fully support this ordinance.
Thank you. Councilmember Turner, any further comments? Yes, Councilmember Turner.
Hang on. Yes. Now I know this is a popular ordinance with a number of people, even on the council. And on the surface, it looks like we're just trying to protect people from harm. And I'm strongly in favor of firearms safety, just so you know that. But I think we need to look beneath the surface and understand the implications of an ordinance like this. Do we have a problem that this ordinance will solve? Or is this just making a political statement? Is there a risk to the city? We know that this will probably be difficult to enforce. That means it probably will not be enforced often. This puts our police in a difficult situation and creates potential liability issues for the city. Further, passing a law that cannot be enforced just creates disrespect for the law. People generally keep firearms in their homes to protect themselves from break-ins or home invasions. If I am reading this ordinance correctly, it appears the only way a homeowner can keep a firearm readily available in his home is to put it in a holster and wear it around the house. I think this is incredibly dangerous, and I sincerely hope that we're not pushing people to do that. Finally, there are liability issues. If there's a break-in and someone is injured or killed because they could not get to their firearms, is the city liable? Our attorney says no, but I'm skeptical. And I will accept his judgment. But even a frivolous lawsuit will cost the city thousands of dollars to get dismissed. And we have received letters from 2 organizations indicating that the city will be sued if we pass this ordinance. They say we do not have the authority to pass this ordinance because state law fully occupies this space and preempts cities from taking further action. They also say that we're violating a Supreme Court decision, the Heller versus, I think it's Washington, D.C., which declared restrictions on firearm storage in the home to be unconstitutional. Are we going to fight this issue when we get sued? And is that the way we should be spending the city's money? We will rescind the ordinance once we get sued. Will we rescind this ordinance if we get sued? Won't that still cost us money? Will we be liable for other sides, for the other side's attorney's fees? If so, what's the point? I think these 2 opposing letters are significant, and I'm formally requesting our city clerk to include these letters in the published meetings and online so that our citizens can have access to them. I see this ordinance primarily as a political statement. However, this seems to have substantial risks. I am recommending that we do not vote on this tonight, but refer it back to the city attorney to further investigate the issues raised in these letters. Given state law, do we even have the authority to pass such an ordinance? And would we be violating the Supreme Court decision referenced here? So those are my comments, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. So do we have a motion to introduce by title only and waive the first reading of an ordinance of the City Council of Monte Sereno enacting Chapter 4.20 gun storage regulations?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, I got the motion by Mayor Pro Tem Elahi with the second from Councilmember Mekachek. Do we want to take a vote before I introduce attorney? Just try to...
I would recommend you read the title of the ordinance and then the council members can vote on its introduction.
Okay. Ordinance number NS-226, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Monte Sereno enacting Chapter 4.20 gun storage regulations.
All right, and the motion is a motion to introduce by title only and waive the first reading of the ordinance. And we've had a motion and a second on that. So roll call vote, please.
Okay. Councilmember Lawler,
Yes.
Councilmember Turner,
No.
Councilmember Mekachek,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Elahi,
Aye.
and Mayor Luthold.
Yes.
And that motion passes 4-1.
Thank you. Okay, turning now to item number 2 on the new business. This is a study session regarding the fiscal year 2021 to 2022 budget. This is for study session and discussion Before we get started on that, if there are any members of the public, let's go ahead and open this for public comment at this time. If there are any members of the public wishing to make comment or statement regarding the budget and the budget study session for tonight, please raise your hand to be recognized. Seeing none, we will close public comment at this time and move to the study session. So, Mr. Leonardis, do you have a staff report, or are there others here to speak to this tonight?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I will introduce the item, and then our Finance and Administrative Officer, Reynolds Samaranos, will be taking the lead on this report. This is just the first of several what we call budget study sessions leading up to the budget, which will be completed and adopted by Council at our June 15th meeting. This year, our strategic goals meeting is June 1st. And between the June 1st and June 15th meeting, we will be kind of putting the finishing touches on the final budget document for adoption. However, this meeting is the first pass, as mentioned, and it kind of highlights the numbers where we're at. Monte Sereno has a tendency to budget very conservatively. Think of it in terms of the glass half empty versus the glass, or I should say the glass, yes, glass half empty versus the glass half full approach. And essentially, we have a lot of detail, a lot of numbers, but there are a number of things that will be brought forward for council's consideration, mainly being a $2 million street project in the capital improvement budget over in the La Rinconada neighborhood. And there also is some good news coming with the budget where we had applied for some grants, and we also have HEROES Act funding, which could be coming into play in the future to help offset some of these CIP items that we are considering. There's pros and cons to having money in the bank versus having money put towards projects. That, you know, right now, money that you have in savings is not earning a high level of interest. So you'll see our interest revenues have been down in the last year, whereas the cost of construction for a big project like the La Rinconada Streets project always goes up at a greater rate over time than the interest you'll get in the bank. So the longer you put off the project, the more it costs. So those are decisions that council can make as trade-off. And of course, we have to take into consideration all of our newly adopted budget policies and items as well when making these decisions. So tonight, again, is just the first step, dipping our toe in the water, putting the preliminary numbers. The council met on August, or not council, the staff, excuse me, the staff met on April 21st, and we had a meeting and we asked everybody from their department to bring forth what expenses they thought would be coming in the fiscal year 21-22, which essentially begins July 1st, our fiscal 21-22 budget. And we compiled all those figures and put those into this report as well. And from there, I will turn it over to Mr. Samaranos, and he can add to what I just said. He wrote a narrative, which was delivered to you, explaining some of the highlights, and he will be covering those points.
Thank you, Mr. Leonardis. What I'd like to do is put on the screen somehow the charts that I'd like to just go over. I'm not sure what the protocol is to doing that.
We can do that, Mr. Samaranos. We can do that through potentially promoting you and sharing your screen if you think that will be most efficient.
Yeah.
If those are attachments that have been added to the agenda, we can bring them up just in the split screen agenda, but they may be a bit small. So,
okay.
Mr. Radcliffe or Mr. Kyson, are we able to promote Mr. Samaranos to a co-presenter and then give him access to share his screen?
We are working on it, Mr. Mayor.
Great.
In the meantime, if there are any questions that could jump out.
I have questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Councilmember Turner.
Okay, there were two emails that came from Mr. Samaranos right before the meeting that I didn't get a chance to review because I had meetings before this meeting. So I wanted to ask some general questions, if I may. One is approximately how much money do we have in reserve currently?
Currently, our total balance, let's see, I'll go to that spreadsheet here.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to, let's see, currently we have a total fund balance of 5.8 million.
5.8?
Yes,
Okay, if we approve this budget tonight, well, I know we're not going to, but if we look at the expenses, how much will we have in the reserve at the end of the coming year?
well, there's two scenarios. One is the scenario that we would be spending about 2.6 million drawn down from our reserves, bringing us down to 3.2 million. But then Mr. Leonardis identified two potential new funding sources, a HEROES Act for 645,000 and a federal highway trust fund dollars for 510, totaling 1.2 million. So if we were able to obtain those two funding sources, our reserves would go from 5.8 million to 4.3 million net.
Okay, now I believe we're required to keep at least 1 year's operating expenses in the reserve. Is that right?
That's correct. And so what we're looking at in this year's budget, proposed budget, is approximately 3.7 million in our operating expense budget.
Okay, I'll hold my questions for the other questions for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And did we get the screen sharing availability yet?
Yes, the screen sharing functionality is up and going.
So Mr. Samaranos, you should have the ability to click share screen now.
Okay,
And go ahead and share.
I'm sorry, I've never done this before. Do I press the share screen?
Yeah, if your Zoom has if you're using a PC, bottom center should have a share screen. And then you choose the screen that you wish to share from your available screens. There you go.
Okay. Make this smaller. How does that look on your side?
It's acceptable, I think. If people have questions,
Okay.
then they can ask you to zoom in on something.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is thank you for letting me present the first proposal of our FY 2021-22 budget. What we have assembled is a total revenue of 4.8 million, which is approximately 300,000 higher, or 6.1% higher versus our mid-year budget. And so in looking at the specific details behind this, on property tax, for example, we're going from 2.2 million to 2.1 million, a reduction of about 100,000, or reducing it by 500,000. I'm sorry, by 5%. And that comes from an estimating property tax to be lower due to property values going down, homeowners applying for lower assessed property valuations, and uncertainty of what the state government might do with respect to property taxes. Last March, when the pandemic started, and there was a big concern about property tax, we were looking at a state where homeowners were not paying their mortgages, and we were looking at a situation that there might be a decline in property values across the board, and homeowners would, as a result, apply for lower assessment values on their properties. I guess 12 months later, it just doesn't seem like that's the case, but yet I still put in the budget reduction of potential property tax. And so for that, it's reduced by 5%. Licensing and permits, we're going from, I guess that's about 600,000 in license and permits. It's 230,000 lower versus our mid-year budget. And that's really driven by the Montalvo Oaks development project, which accounted for about 260,000 this year in fees. And so I took a look at the run rate of licenses and permits and adjusted that figure down to 556 for a reduction of 230. Franchise tax seems to be stagnant over time. That includes franchise fees from PG&E, San Jose Water, Comcast, West Valley Collection, and so forth. Intergovernment, that's forecasted at 227,000. It's lower by 81 or 26.2% versus the mid-year budget. And that's attributed to the COPS grant is forecasted at 100,000, which is typically what we've done for many years. Quite often that 100,000 grant is exceeded, but for budgeting purposes, we use the 100,000 as a benchmark. So that was actually reduced by 65,000 as this year we received 165,000. That's simply a pass-through to the city of Los Gatos for police services. This is also offset by two new grants that we're looking at. It's the Winchester Boulevard Class 4 protected bike lanes, Measure B, for about 70,000, and VRF for 24,000. And then there's another grant, Highway 9 Safety Improvement Gap Closure for 27,000 that our city engineer has identified as potential funding sources in that category. Taking a look at other revenues, it's going from 445,000 to 385, or a reduction of 59,000 or 13,000 less than the mid-year budget. So this includes a reduction of road impact fees, which is netting out to about 91,000. And this reduction is primarily driven by again, I go back to the Montalvo Oaks project, which this year generated 117,000 fees in this category. This particular line item is offset by several CIP projects. One is the City Hall parking lot for 7,000. Part of this is including the annex building improvement project, 18,000. And then the neighborhood improvement project, La Rinconada neighborhood project for 65,000. And then in miscellaneous revenues within the same category, we have 199,000, again, relating to the annex building ADA improvement project, as well as a housing element project from two grants, LEAP grant for 65,000 and a REAP grant for 20,000. Looking at gas tax, that's driven by, I guess it's going from 325,000 from 160,000 this year. That's an increase of about 165,000. And that's driven by two major items. One is the Winchester Boulevard Class 4 protected bike lanes. There's gas tax revenues of about 102,000 expected, and then an SB1 RMRA funds for about 74,000. Investment income, that's going to be lower severely, going to about 25,000. That's simply because the LAIF returns have gone down significantly to about 55 basis points. And I took an average balance of LAIF to be about 4.5 million next year, given all the projects that we're doing, projected to do next year. Real estate property tax, 207,000, higher by 75,000 versus the mid-year budget. That's driven by an SB2 grant for planning, for the planning department, and lower real estate transaction activities. Sales tax, 581,000 from, I guess, 524 higher versus the mid-year budget. And that's driven by a relief fund grant that's to be used for a CIP Highway 9 safety improvement gap project, closure project. And then fines, that's pretty insignificant.
Let's stop there briefly and see if council members have any questions about revenue. I see Mayor Pro Tem Elahi has his hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot to digest, so that's a good idea to do it one section at a time. Curious, you have two items. I've got a couple of questions. One is, there's two separate line items, one for property tax and one for the real property tax. What's the difference?
Real property tax, let's see. That's related to real estate transactions. It's primarily related to real estate transactions.
What does that mean?
Originally, but this year and in the budget, I'm putting in an SB2 grants in that particular category.
Yeah, when you say real estate transactions, how
Is it a transfer tax?
Yeah, the transfer tax.
Okay, so this is a real estate transfer tax basically, and the property tax
Yes.
is the regular assessment taxes.
Yes, and that's under the property tax.
Okay, so the property tax I think is going to be larger than you're expecting for two reasons. The properties in Monte Sereno get reassessed when they change hands. So the tax would be higher, generated higher. And the second reason is the Prop 19 that has passed, which means anytime property is passing on to the children, it's going to get reassessed. Not almost any time, just obviously some assessments. You may not see, and I think it was effective February 12th or something. So we may not see as much of an impact this year as we may see next year. Our calendar year ends in is it July or September?
June.
So we may not see much impact on this year, but you're projecting this for next year's budget. I suspect you will see a larger impact because of those two reasons. And so we should have more funds available under property tax headings. That was something that I guess you'll have to watch just to make sure. And it'll be a positive development, so that's a good thing.
So that's an opportunity for.
Yeah, I think we will get more funds out of regular property taxes because of reassessments. And I suspect the transfer tax will also go up because as properties are reassessed, more beneficiaries, if their children, will have more of an incentive to sell the property rather than hold on to it, because now, where their parents might have been paying $5,000 a year, the tax now all of a sudden goes to $30,000 a year as the property gets reassessed from the original 500,000 basis to $5 million basis. So I think you probably have some room to work with on those two items. The gas tax, you're expecting an increase on gas tax. And I think you gave us an explanation on that because the gas tax has increased basically. Is that what's going on?
Well, I identified two specific items that our city engineer has identified for her projects, for the CIP projects. And the two that she's identified was the specific gas tax, the 102,000, and an SB1 gas tax related item. She calls it the RMRA fund for 74,000.
All right. Okay, those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. And I wanted to just comment related to that last answer. And I noticed this in several places, Mr. Samaranos, as you spoke through. There was an unusual event with an SB1 grant or an SB2 or some other revenue source. You may have called those out in some other location, but I would suggest it might be helpful to us to include those notes right on the revenue item with note 1, and then the unusual event just at the bottom of this page and the scope of that, so that we can immediately see when you see $160,000 increase on the gas tax, that 150,000 of that comes from SB1, or for example, if that was the case. Just so that it's all here on the same page. And
on the same page. Okay.
What's regular and what's unusual. And also, you might be able to indicate whether that's anticipated to be one time only, or whether that is potentially recurring in future years.
Okay.
Other council member questions? I see Councilmember Makachuk has his hand up.
Yes, I understand that this is just the first version that we're looking at, and staff are going to take the comments and the input from everyone. So I can see a number of changes coming up. One of the items in the property tax line is when those 36 properties are sold in Montalvo Oaks, that's going to generate property tax. And I do not believe that is anticipated in this version, but I believe it will be in the next version. The other, I have a question and a comment. My question is, are there CIP or one-time projects that are included in the 2020-2021 budget, so that you kind of have an ongoing operational column or budget, and then you kind of got a one-time projects column that what we're seeing here. Could you make a comment on that, please?
Yeah. Yes, Councilmember Makachuk. I think the best way to approach that is simply to take that column mid-year budget and break it out between operating budget and the CIP. And I think actually that ideally that's what I wanted to do, but for time's sakes, I presented it this way. But you're absolutely correct. The best way to present this for comparative purposes is to break out the operating budget for the mid-year and parcel out the CIP component and show that as a comparison. And that makes perfect sense, because then you can see what the carry forward values would be in those respective CIP projects. So I will change the format on the next presentation for that.
Great, thank you. Other council member questions, comments before we move on from revenue? Yeah, Mayor Pro Tem Elahi, you have another?
I just wanted to follow up on the transfer tax. Different cities have different transfer tax rates for transfer of properties. Is this transfer tax that Monte Sereno property is charged, how does that compare to the transfer tax for San Jose or Saratoga or Los Gatos? I would be interested in getting some feel for that, to see if you're too high, too low, or whatever. That could be something that can examine. Also, for this purpose, I know it makes it a little bit harder to get some projections, but I do think we need to probably try to get an estimate on what, like Councilmember Brian McKichek pointed out, what kind of revenue impact will the hacienda properties have? Those two things are going to happen. When they sell, the properties are going to be reassessed. So your property tax basis is going to be higher. You get more funds from those. And when they transfer, you got the transfer tax portion also coming in. And I don't know, and that's a lot of properties. I mean, you're comparing, for Monte Sereno, that's a lot of properties out there, 35 or 40. So I think it'd be useful to at least get some estimate on what their market price is, what they're going to be selling it for, and what their assessed basis right now is. So we get a more accurate picture on what our budget would look like, and also some assessment on what we need to have a conversation with whoever is the owners of those properties as to what their projections are as to how many units they expect to sell in the next fiscal year and beyond. Because otherwise, we don't really have the right budget items. We may be too tight, and there may be more money available, or we may be projecting too high. So something, so if that can be addressed, I think that would be very useful.
So if I can answer Mayor Pro Tem Elahi's question, Mayor. We estimate about 32 properties, an average of about 2.5 million per property in the Montalvo Oaks development, which comes out to be about $80 million times 1.25%. And then we get about 9 cents on the dollar on that, or 7.5 cents on the dollar, something like that on that. Along with the transfer taxes, we're guessing about $90,000 to $100,000 in property tax revenue. So if you took that first line on the revenues sheet and you saw 2,249,523, and you see 2,134,440, it reflects $115,000 decline. Those projections were offered from Assessor Stone's office last March as Mr. Samaranos, starting last March in the pandemic, as Mr. Samaranos alluded to. Assuming that is a conservative estimate on property taxes, and say that number is not negative 5.1, but it's flat. And then assuming that we will be getting all of those homes closed in 21-22, there could be another 100,000 on top of that, which is essentially about a 5%, 4.5% increase. However, those are numbers that will be brought back at the mid-year. Right now, we budgeted conservatively, and the objective was not to overestimate and then come up short. It's to try to project what is close or maybe a little bit below and be pleasantly surprised later on. That is kind of the goal of fiscal conservative budgeting.
I appreciate that. I just want to get also get the right picture. I mean, it's good to be conservative, but if you have done some numbers and if you think the estimate is only going to be another $100,000, then that's good. You actually considered it.
Yes.
But it does make a difference, because we also have to try to figure out as you go on, whether we're going to be doing any. Well, I'll save that for the expense side of it. But thank you for your response.
Sounds good. Thank you. Councilmember Turner, questions on revenue side there?
Yes. So for Montalvo Oaks, this would probably end all our licenses and permits from them. Is that correct?
That's
Nothing
correct.
for next year.
That's correct.
Correct, yes.
So how did you determine then the licenses and permits for the coming year?
I removed the impact of the Montalvo Oaks project, and then I looked at the run rate of permit activities from this fiscal year, and then extrapolated a projection for this year. I'm sorry, for next year.
Okay.
So in the that document, that narrative document that shows the significant changes of fiscal year 2021 mid-year budget versus the first proposal of fiscal year 2022 budget, I sort of summarize some of the thoughts that went through the differences, the delta in these in this report. That's the email that you probably received a couple of days ago, last Saturday.
Great, thank you. All right, we can probably go ahead and proceed on to the expense sections. And if you can walk us through the major items that you feel deserve to be pointed out there, or good, looks like you have a summary sheet.
Okay, so on the expenditure side, we're going in total to 7.3 million. That's 1.8 million higher versus the mid-year budget, or 33% higher. And that's driven by, taking a look at personnel, for example, that's our staff, are looking at going to 1.3 million. It's 560 lower versus last year, versus this year. And that's driven by having the existing staff, our two admins, city clerk, city engineer, city manager, city planner, the finance officer, and also includes a 1.5% salary increase per the MOU. And then last year we funded the retirement, the OPEB, unfunded pension liabilities, which was about 740,000. So the net effect of those two, we're basically going down 560,000 versus last year's expense. Law enforcement, I think I projected an increase of 10%, but that comes from a variety of things. First, I made a provision for the police contract to go up to 3% by 3% versus this year, which is an increase of 28,000. And then the grant pass-through, which hits this line item, I budgeted down to 100,000 as opposed to the 148 that passed through that account this year. On construction, we're going to 345,000 or 270,000 higher versus the mid-year budget. And that's driven exclusively by this CIP project on the Winchester Boulevard Class 4 protected bike lane project for 340,000. Going to general government, that's going to 484,000 or an increase of 144,000 or 42% versus the mid-year budget. And this year, or I'm sorry, in the budget for next year, we're including a new item, which is called the housing element, which I believe is engaging the M Group consultants for a planning project. That's 200,000. And this is offset by lower cost in some administrative support or IT support. Going to maintenance. So maintenance going from 665,000 to 2.7 million. Well, that big chunk of that is primarily related to that CIP project that's listed there on the 2.7 million. So this item is driven by a neighborhood improvements project for Davies neighborhood, 85,000. La Ridconada neighborhood project for 2 million. And then a Highway 9 safety improvement gap closure project for 600,000. In the mid-year budget, we completed the 620,000 pavement management program project. So that's reduced in that particular figure. And that goes back to Councilmember Makachek. If I had that column that shows the operating budget and the CIP comparison, then it would pop out rather quickly, and you would see what the changes are in those significant values. Administration, that's pretty much staying status quo. Those expenses include the independent consultants, for example, the building inspector, the plan checks. Those are the primary expenses in that category. City attorney going to 171,000, higher by 10,000. I think I included from the base city attorney contract an increase of 3%. And then I took a look at the other law firms that supported our organization and just use a run rate for that to get to a total of 171,000 for legal expenses next year. Building maintenance going to 645,000 or 16 higher by 16,000 versus the mid-year budget. This includes the, again, CIP Annex Building ADA Improvement Project for 600,000 and provisions for unexpected maintenance of 16,000, along with the ongoing maintenance that we have in this current year. Equipment improvement, I'm seeing an increase of to 72,000 or increase or lower by 13,000 versus the mid-year budget. This year we purchased some iPads for the office, so that's kind of reflects the lower $13,000 amount. And then, of course, city audit projecting for 4,000 higher to 48,000 next year. That's driven by possible new reports that might need to be produced, as well as increase in audit costs. Questions on the expenditures?
Everybody's quiet. Looks like you did well.
So the way I translate this is, last year we presented a figure, which I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a $90,000 deficit number from on the operating budget column that says, if we did everything that this budget says, we'll come up short by 90,000 and have to draw from our reserves to pay for that. On the CIP side, the capital improvement projects, we've got 2.5 million that would be drawn from our reserves, and that would be spread out across different categories. And that's where I have this other page. So here it kind of shows, let me make it smaller. So I don't know if you can read that. So the way I've laid this out. I'm sorry, Mr. Councilmember Mekchin.
Increase the size, please.
Increase the size. Is that good? Better?
Better, thank you.
Okay. So the way this works in this presentation is you have that deficit. And so that deficit gets funded by the different funds that you have within your reserves. And so initially, I simply put it into these categories. You have the general fund, you have the traffic safety fund, law enforcement, gas tax fund, storm drain. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but I'm going through these different categories. And so based on the expenses or the net deficit that I laid out in the income statement or financial statements, it flows here through, you're going to have a negative balance. And so what we would normally do is transfer monies from our LAIF fund, which is the same, which is laid out in the same way as the gas, the traffic and law enforcement in general. We would simply transfer it over from here over to there to fund it. So the bottom line is, when all the deficits are taken out from our reserves, we go from, here's the 90,000 and the 2.5 million. we go from 5.8 million in balances to 3.2 million. And then I alluded to earlier that we have two pending funding sources that City Manager Leonardis has pointed out to me. There's a HEROES Act for $645,000, and then there's the Federal Highway Trust Fund dollars for 510, which is 1.2 million. So if we get that, that lowers that deficit of 2.7 to 1.3. So instead of going to 3.2 million, you go from 5.8 million to 4.3 million in balances. So that's kind of how I look at the budget in terms of the flow of funds for the agency. So in that sense, we would only be drawing down 1.4 million from our reserves.
Great, thank you. I'll turn to Councilmember Turner's question in just a second. I had one first. I wanted to just get your response. This year, we spent roughly $700,000 dealing with yet another recalculation by the state of unfunded pension liabilities. And are we going to get hit again by another of those in the future as interest rates go down and the state continues to mismanage those funds and change the rules on us? And do we need to budget for that, or at least be aware that that could be coming?
Yes, that is a very strong possibility since yeah, the performance on the CalPERS and whatnot are down. And so, yeah, I'm expecting that amount to increase.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Turner.
Yes, I've got a question here. If you were looking here at if we don't get any funds from the HEROES Act or the Federal Highway Trust, so it appears we're looking at a 2.5 million deficit in the capital budget. Most of this is for the annex and for the La Rinconada program. This funds, I assume, will come from reserves. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Let me show you. Let me share another screen here that shows. Let's see.
While we're waiting,
Yes.
addressing
I think-
Councilmember Turner's
Oh, sorry.
question, the annex building we put into the budget last year, we budgeted 600,000 for that, has since been offset partially by two grants totaling almost 200,000.
So my question is, may I ask, what is being done to that project, the La Rinconada? And could the scope of that project be cut back? Is that something that we could look at, during this budget session?
I'll have to touch base with our city engineer, Jessica,
Yeah.
to respond to that. But regarding that, most of that deficit number is driven by this figure here. This project called Neighborhood Improvement Project. Yes, it's the one that you were just describing. Okay.
Okay, so that's an outstanding question that we won't answer tonight then.
Okay, I will
Okay,
ask.
so
city
I've got
engineer.
another question, and this has to do with your personnel costs. The retirement employer, are you going to get to that of 814 for CalPERS payments, the one that Mayor Luthold just talked about? Does this become an unfunded pension liability then? 01625T. I thought we paid 750 last year.
Yes, we did.
So this one is in addition to that?
Councilmember Turner.
In this budget, no, there's no provisions for that particular hit. We are funding it, as the payroll goes, we're funding it at each payroll, we're constantly funding that, the CalPERS retirement plan to that extent. What happens is I guess they do a revaluation of what the returns were versus what's needed in the account. And that's when that unfunded liability comes into play. So I guess that would be a calculation that our actuarialist person would.
Actuarian, yeah.
Or perhaps, I don't know, I guess I could reach out to CalPERS and see if there's someone that could give me some risk exposure that we might have.
Because that's pretty big. I mean, if we pay our employees almost 800,000 and our unfunded pension liability is another 800,000, that's 1.6. And we pay the Los Gatos police 1.2. And if we'll only get, 3 or 4 million for next year, then we're pretty much spent. So that's what I'm concerned about. So we need to look at cutting somewhere else, I guess.
So, Mr. Samaranos and Ms. Councilmember Turner, if I could jump in. Last year, as you know, we made a one-time payment to CalPERS, about $500,000. And then we paid the lesser amount for the other benefits, other post-employee benefits, which is like $70,000. The idea was to pay both of those in full at the time. And that was reflected upon 2018 numbers, I believe. This year, we will get the results of the pay down of that $500,000. It'll come in July, and it'll reflect the 2019 numbers. So it lags a little bit. So it's very difficult to tell what it will cost or what they will try to say if you want to pay off your unfunded pension liability. So you're fully funded at 100%, what number that will be this year. I would anticipate that number will be probably less than $50,000 because we paid $500,000 last year. However, we will do some research, as Mr. Samaranos mentioned, reach out to CalPERS, and that's the purpose. This is the first budget meeting, and we're going to pin down that number in subsequent budget meetings if we can get it. But typically, they do not release the report until July, which is after budget season, which is also a year lagging. So you're kind of like 2 years behind in a way. It's a little bit difficult to understand. Regarding the other question, Engineer Khan is on the line, and she can answer the question about the La Rinconada Streets project and more details on that if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Hi, good evening, council members. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So the question I heard was, what exactly is that La Rinconada project? And then also, is it scalable? So the project is to put in curb and gutter, so to improve the drainage on a part of La Rinconada, but mostly on Clara Street, Natalie, and Xena, which are the 3 lowest PCIs, or the worst pavement conditions. Actually, I believe the only streets that are now considered in poor condition in the city. The total of that project is estimated to be about $2 million as it is put in the budget. It is scalable since there are 3 different streets. I believe Xena on its own was about $1 million, and then the other 2 were 500,000. So it's definitely possible to piecemeal that street over several years if that is what the council desires.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Engineer Khan, are you involved in the grants that are being looked at as potential revenue sources as well? And do you have any information, or Mr. Leonardis, about when we're going to know about the grant funding that we might be able to send that direction, or offset, or use to offset that direction?
Well, thank you, Mayor. And this evening, right before the meeting began, late this afternoon, we received correspondence from Congress Member Eshu's office saying that she has submitted our request for the federal grant, which is a matching grant. We originally requested about 650,000, but we only get 80%. So they would be giving us like 510,000. We would be coming up with some number, 120, 130,000 of our own. This is for the Highway 9 safety gap. And then there was the correspondence we sent previously about the HEROES Act, which was 645,000. So those funds are out there. We're not sure what the stipulations will be, what they can be used for, if they can only be used for specific things, COVID related or whatnot. So we're still waiting for details on that. I was on a call with Congressmember Eschy's office about that about a month ago. But the good news is that it was passed in the House, and it was signed by the president, and the president is going on the road now to promote it. So we're just waiting for the final details on that. We hope that that comes through. When it comes to, there was a question earlier in the night about reserves and how much reserves we would have if we were to put down the full 2 million for the La Rinconada Streets project. And our reserve policy is that Monte Sereno maintains a balance of $3.5 million. And if we were able to get one of those grants, we can easily maintain that reserve policy and do the whole project. I would suggest at this time we continue to consider doing the full project at one time, trying to obtain an economy of scale and just see how the funds play out over time. And I believe the way it will work is if we submit the project to bid, the work will not be completed until next year. And by that time, we should know the disposition of all the funding. And we should be able to make a decision, or we should be able to submit the project out for bid with 1 or 2 streets, and then subsequently get the remainder of the project done in the following year. So there's a little flexibility to what we can do, and but the goal would be to try to get it all done at one time. I think we can achieve some economies of scale. And again, on these types of projects, the longer you go out in time, the more inflation takes hold. Whereas right now interest rates are low, so money in the bank doesn't get you as much return. But the cost of the project year over year could range 10% higher in the future. And that's why deferring it longer, deferring the inevitable, as Ms. Khan stated, is the worst streets in Monte Sereno, will only cost us more in the long run.
Great, thank you. Other council member questions, comments? Mayor Pro Tem Elahi.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of numbers that have been crunched. What I would really like to see is going out a little bit more. I mean, you get a one-year budget, which has got some unusual things that are built in, unusual expenses that are coming in, and we have a deficit. I'd like to see projections going at least 3 to 5 years out. So do a 2021-22 budget, or 22-23 budget, a 24-25 budget. I think that'll give us some sense of whether things are going to flatten out, or the unusual things that we're getting now are not going to be there next year, or the unusual expenses that we expect next year. So, we don't want to be just hitting $2 million deficit this year, 2 million next year, 2 million next year. I mean, it'll make it easier to stomach a $2 million deficit this year if next year it's not going to be there. So I know these are still going to be projections, but it's worth for us to have a little bit further visibility of what's going to happen out there. So I would request, and obviously we understand these are going to be approximations and estimates at best, but at least it'll help us understand what is unusual this year, which we don't expect next year. So if you could do that, I would request that.
Yeah, I guess I would just jump in and say that the breakouts that Councilmember Mekachek and I talked about, both on the revenue and the capital improvement side, should pretty much normalize this so we can see what the underlying operating budget is, which you can just imagine adding 5% to everything going out each year versus those capital improvement projects, which are discretionary to us. So I'm not sure we need to necessarily engage staff in simply projecting those out, since we're going to have that breakdown on the ones we see. And obviously future councils are going to have to balance their capital improvement versus their revenues if there's any major changes. So I would just suggest that may not be the best use of staff time, as opposed to tightening up the budget we're looking at. But Mr. Samaranos, if it's easy for you to do a clean projection, of what stays versus what goes in terms of future years. That might be another alternate view that would be helpful to what Mayor Pro Tem Elahi mentions.
Well, whatever the city council prefers, I'll deliver. Just make your requests. But yeah, I think you're right. You take a look at the operating budget, and then you can know that that's sort of your recurring baseline expenses, grow it by 3%, 5%, or by inflation. And then I know our city engineer has provided me with a CIP projections for a few years out, so I can just layer that in to the analysis and complete it.
Yeah, either layering it in or just again footnotes.
Yeah,
Of course,
footnotes.
that suggests that we're going to read those footnotes, or you're going to tell us about them when we come to them.
Yes, and our city engineer will help me do that, since she's in charge of all those major beautiful projects that she puts through.
Yeah, and we would definitely, I think we really appreciate what we've learned about pavement improvement and keeping the maintenance up, and we're still struggling with all of the deferred maintenance. So both of you, that's very much appreciated. Okay.
Well,
Mr.
just a comment on what Mr. Leonardis said about street maintenance and all that. You know, I'm a resident of the city of Orinda, and for many years they deferred street maintenance. You know, anytime a tax initiative comes, we'd always vote against it for many, many years. And then finally we had to bite the bullet and fix these streets. And so, you know, I have to concur with what Mr. City Manager Leonardo said about doing these projects on the streets, because gosh, it's just going to cost you a fortune if you don't do it now. Bite the bullet.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Absolutely, and the maintenance, the deterioration gets worse as the street ages, as opposed to catching it early. So we're in that same catch-up mode. All right, do you have other things to walk us through on your charts?
No, that pretty much wraps up my presentation. Pretty much just taking a look at our budget from the 35,000 foot level, and then just honing in on the major items that we need to address.
Great, thank you. Other council member comments, observations, thoughts, desires for the next round of delving into these numbers? Looks like we've covered things fairly completely, and you did a good job answering our questions tonight, so thank you. Mr. Leonardis, did you have anything further, or Ms. Khan, did you have anything that you wish to add? If so, please speak up about this. Otherwise, we can probably close the study session and move forward.
Thank you, Mayor. I would just say that in reference to what Mr. Samaranos mentioned, he'll be adding another column to break out the CIP stuff for the next study session. And then what Mayor Pro Tem Elahi mentioned about, you know, like a 5-year projection, we could probably do a graph on that, projecting revenues for 5 years versus expenses for 5 years. And a simple understanding of that with no CIP included for illustrative purposes. So we can bring both of those things back, I think would not be an issue. And if there's anything else council wants or thinks of in now between now and the next meeting, of course, we are available to receive your questions via email.
Great, thank you very much.
Before we move on, I would recommend we confirm there's no public comment for this item.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and reopen public comment. If there are any members of the public wishing to be heard on the matters in the study session tonight, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we will close public comment officially for the study session and go ahead and move on. So next on the agenda is committee and commission reports. Any council members have committee and commission reports? Please raise your hands and speak up. All right, Councilmember Makachuk.
The commissions, the JPAs that I'm on, I'll try to do a comprehensive report at the next meeting, but it seems like the JPAs I'm on are probably going to be raising their rates and becoming more expensive. So I'll leave that kind of bad news, if you will, to the future. But there are some increases that are coming and some that are actually very, very exciting. But perhaps Mr. Leonardis can speak to, and I'm sure he's going to talk about it in his manager's report, but it may be good for him to speak to the C-click fix at this point in time, because I was kind of involved in that at the last meeting.
All right, thank you. And actually, you bring up an interesting point that may also relate to the budget study session. And I just wanted to mention to Mr. Leonardis, in looking at these, you may want to, if you haven't already, reach out to our various JPAs and determine whether there are any significant anticipated changes coming up in the following years with Monte Sereno's participation. That may have already been captured for the most part in some of your analysis, but we might want to double check if any of our participation costs and anything is going up.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Typically, in the month of May, we start to see everyone's annual letter about the projected increases, whether it's for police services or, as you mentioned, JPAs or insurance, annual insurance premiums, et cetera, et cetera. So we usually will get all those incorporated by the very final budget numbers. Those are costs we perceive as really not much we can do about. For instance, if the police contract, as Mr. Samaranos mentioned, is projected to go up 3%, that we have to accept that and incorporate that into our budget, as opposed to say, hey, we don't want to give you that 3%. We don't think it's worth it. That doesn't necessarily work that way. However, we will definitely get all those incorporated into the final budget version, and we might be revisiting some of those numbers in the future budget study session meetings here, the ones that are significant.
Great, thank you. And Councilmember Mekachek brought up the C-click, et cetera. Were you going to comment on that later, or did you want to comment now?
I can comment on that now. So right now they sent over their agreement, and I was going to have Mr. Rudin review their agreement and let us know if there's any issues with the agreement, and we'll bring that back before council. I was also planning on bringing that back during the strategic goals as part of the customer service and operational excellence plan for further discussion, and bring forward some ideas for an overall implementation plan at that time, kind of an overview at that time for council discussion. So that's what we're considering with C-click fix at the current time. Last but not least, I was going to be meeting with Ms. Khan and Mr. Fadapour, building and engineering, to get their feedback on the product and some implementation ideas as well.
Great, thanks. Yeah, let's go ahead. Any other committee commission reports from council members? Seeing none, I have attended the library JPA and taking a look at their reopening, which is very exciting. They have increased services, and the libraries now are basically at limited capacity, but open for full use. So if you have been avoiding the Santa Clara County library system, please feel free to return and enjoy the library in person. We had a lot of discussion. They did a wonderful pivot this year to providing e-resources. We heard a lot of great comments from people, and as well as the librarians, about the packages of books that they began creating, and allowing people to come in and pick up bundles of books for checkout during the COVID times. Things are really looking up as they come back. The library budgets are extremely solid. Their budget is around $55 million. So We can be jealous of their budgets as well as their incredible fiscal management that the library performs. It's just a wonderful, wonderful resource for the whole valley here. And the JPA is really one of the most ideal JPAs you could ever have. The other news from the library is Campbell is breaking ground on their new library construction project almost as we speak. And they're moving to temporary facility at the rec center while they break ground to completely revamp the Campbell Library, as well as, I believe it's Police and Emergency Services are going to share the same building there. So that's an exciting project. If we're down in Campbell, take a look around, see what's going on. And if that's your library of choice, be ready to go to the rec center for any physical pickups or library use you need. So that's my report on that. And we'll try to work with staff as well as Nextdoor to make sure that all of the announcements related to the libraries are getting up on Nextdoor and getting circulated to our residents. Anyone else? Any other committee commission reports? Okay, seeing none, we will move to the council member comments. Councilmember Lawler.
Thanks. Yes, I just actually wanted to, I wasn't sure if this was really a commission or committee report, but I wanted to report on the county's vaccination efforts in terms of COVID, and they have officially vaccinated over 70% of residents now have one dose of the vaccine. 43% of our population is fully vaccinated. And the messaging now is primarily focused on the young adults and teens who are somewhat hesitant or not interested. And they are also concerned about folks skipping their second dose because they've heard how sick you get from the second dose. So they're now trying to encourage folks to finish their vaccination protocol. So that's my report for that.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like good news, and hopefully we can spread the word relatively positive about the second doses. So Councilmember Mekachuk.
I just wanted to follow on Councilmember Lawler's comments. We hosted an outdoor event on Saturday, and there were, including the 4 in our family, there were 23 people there. And of those 23, 19 had received at least 1 dose of the vaccine. And going from 19, there were 2 people that were to be vaccinated that were vaccinated on the Sunday, so that brought it to 21. And then 1 person was very allergic, and they're for medical reasons aren't having the vaccine right away. And then 1 person did not plan on getting vaccinated. So in that group, we were very pleased to see the high level of vaccinations. And now when I was vaccinated with my second dose of Pfizer last week, there was no one at the county building that you could walk in and get vaccinated. So right now, I would encourage everyone in the city of Monte Sereno to get vaccinated so that we can get this behind us and gain herd immunity.
Great, thank you. And I was listening to one of the reports on the news today, again, focusing on Santa Clara County and echoing what Councilmember Lawler said. The outreach and cleanup really needs to go on now, is starting to go on. There was suggestion that they may need to get mobile vaccinations going. They may need to go to people's workplaces so that basically it really is a walk-in and no appointment necessary and make it easy for people. So sounds like the county is going to be on top of that. But in addition, that brings it around to the city of Monte Sereno. If there's any outreach we can do at the appropriate time and have a walk-in appointment should be available clinic more locally, or directing people, since we have so many medical facilities nearby, about where those walk-ins would be welcomed. I know a lot of our pharmacies, I've heard, have been going around the pharmacies in the afternoons trying to give away the vaccine doses. So we need to make sure people are aware of that and how easy it is to get vaccinated. And if there is walk-in opportunity, let's make sure we publish it. Mayor Pro Tem Elahi.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the vaccination, it's great. We have a high percentage of vaccination in Santa Clara County and generally in the state of California. But I think everybody still needs to be on high alert considering what's happening with India and other developing countries where you've got these double mutations that are coming up. And people who haven't gotten vaccine they'll be more susceptible to that kind of attack. And people who have got vaccine at least will have some line of defense on it. So we really need to be very, very careful and really double up that people should get vaccination. This little sickness you feel after the second vaccine, I mean, it goes away in about a day and a half. So it's nothing compared to actually getting the virus itself. So let's hope everybody does get vaccinated. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things. One is, I don't know if the city has done a formal plan for post-pandemic opening or reopening with the staff and the offices, and also for us meeting in person. Maybe that would be helpful to get a report on what projections are there to what planning is being done for post-pandemic reopening for the city. And I think the picnic is still out there, and we'll get a report on that at some point. From a commission reports, the time of use rates are coming, which means 4 to 9 p.m. generally will be costing you more to use electricity compared to other times, and people will be encouraged to just try to turn their dishwashers on and everything on, other than in those hours. And initially, it's going to be people will be on it, but if they don't like it after a year, they can get back to what they are on now, in case their rates work better for them, which is now we get charged more after a certain use. And those people could go back after a year and get a refund if they ended up paying more. Silicon Valley Clean Energy has entered into some mega projects, and because of the solar energy issue and because solar energy is not available when you need it most, they're now entering into some very large wind contracts. So we should be able to get with those wind energy contracts. Hopefully, the electricity will be available even during times when it's pain. Those are kind of my reports and my comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And actually, that reminded me of another issue, which is the water company, I believe, has published some information about either pending or possible future lawn conversion, drought-tolerant grants that may be available. If we could take a look at what is either available or in the pipeline and make sure that we're, as a city, publishing that to our constituents on a regular basis, and maybe even if we haven't done so, linking to that and then publishing it on the website if there's any conversion grants. I think drought is going to be a major issue that everybody's going to be thinking about, and I've heard that there is money available to do lawn conversions. So let's see what we can do about that. All right, other council member comments? Seeing none, let's go ahead and move to the city manager's report. Mr. Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor. So I just wanted to bring council's attention to 3 links we added to the website in the last week under residences. As per your request at the last council meeting, we added links to the Los Gatos Parks and Trails maps, as well as the Saratoga Trails maps, linked right to our website. And then one other link is our Objective Design Standards project to inform the public of the upcoming Objective Design Standards revisions and process included there. And I hope that we will get participation when this item comes forward in the not too distant future. And that's my comments for this evening. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just a comment that we should, if we can, publish to our constituents when those new links come live, and that the website is constantly improving. It's so much nicer to look at now, but it's really easy to forget to look at the city website until you need to. I know I have been into the building permit site recently, and the online request and inspection was working perfectly. So kudos to the city on that, and publishing the calendar and making it easy and having everything work very smoothly. So that's great. Just wanted to let staff know how wonderfully that process worked through personal experience. Future agenda items. Councilmember Lawler.
Oh, I just had a quick follow-up. It's not a future agenda item, but City Manager, Mr. Leonardis, I was wondering if you could also include on the website direction on how to get rid of toxic waste, such as paint and other things. I know I had mentioned to you that I had residents come to me asking how they can get rid of their paint, given that West Valley, I think, had closed down their toxic waste drop-off facility during COVID. So there's a lot of paint around. So maybe we could also add that to the website if possible. That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Lawler. And I reached out to the county, the hazardous waste department there, and they did give me a response, as well as the West Valley Collection and Recycling. I received a response from them as well. So I will publicize that information for residents. So thank you for bringing that forward.
Yeah, just to expand on that, I know Ace Hardware has indicated that they're still accepting limited amounts of paint back on a space available basis, and they're happy to tell you what their schedule is about when they're likely to be able to accept fluorescent bulbs, batteries. There are several locations, and so I think expanding on what Councilmember Lawler said, that's a great service that the city can offer new and current residents, if we can just link and tell very practically what the local solutions are to those problems. So thank you. Okay, anyone else? Any future agenda items that we need to be getting onto the calendar that you haven't spoken directly to the city manager about already? None. Okay. Seeing none, then I will adjourn the council meeting for May 4th. May the 4th be with you. Good night, all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.